So the title is AI and Transhuman Morality. Morality, of course, is a topic that humanity's been interested in for millennia, and mostly in the domain of philosophers have thought a lot about it, but it's really the foundation for political systems, for our economic systems, and a huge amount has been written. Transhumanism and AI and some of the technological directions that we kind of see coming, I think up the stakes dramatically. That, you know, today in our general discourse in the United States, hot topics are things like abortion and stem cells and steroids and euthanasia maybe, organ transplants, that kind of thing. Every one of those issues, once you start getting some of these technologies, will become vastly more complex. And so the fact that we haven't really come to resolution to many of those today sort of means it's going to be an interesting time, I think, over the next few decades. Another thread which has me quite upset and worried is that there are some very disturbing and what I consider dangerous trends among some futurists. And so I was just 3 weeks ago at a conference out in Memphis called AGI 08, a group of about 130 scientists or so who are interested in building AIs that have the full capacity of humans and not specialized in some particular area. And so Hugo de Garis was one of the speakers at the conference, and he polled the audience saying, if it were determined that the development of an artificial general intelligence would have a high likelihood of causing the extinction of the human race, how many of you feel that we should still go full speed ahead? And I looked around expecting nobody to raise their hand. Half of the audience raised their hand. The 20th century gave us many examples of philosophies where ideas were put ahead of humans, and they led to horrendous outcomes. We had Nazism, Maoism, Stalinism, and Rwanda genocide. So here, just a sort of a little example, I thought I'd poll the audience. How many see the dancer going clockwise? Really, only one? Oh, a couple, okay. How many see her going counterclockwise? Okay, about half.
Changed halfway.
And then try switching it. It's sort of it's remarkably challenging to many of these illusions. It's easy to flip, but this one is particularly hard. I think this is a nice little metaphor for some of the issues around morality, where there are at least two perspectives that I think people can adopt, and it sometimes is very, very hard to flip to the other perspective. In many areas, there's sort of an inside view or a personal view or a subjective view and an outside view or an objective view. For example, in physics, the outside view of space and time is a single space-time manifold. There's no sense of now. There's no sense of time moving or flowing. And yet, from us living in this structure, we very much have a sense of now, a personal now, and we have a sense of motion through time. And I think that same distinction applies to morality, where the internal view is sort of from the perspective of personal experience. You have a personal sense of what's right and wrong. You have a personal morality. We have very human infrastructure like social systems that have mandates, religious traditions. And then there's sort of an external view which tries to objectify it. And the philosophers are trying to kind of get an outside perspective with which to clarify some of the distinctions and concepts that arise. Evolutionary psychology is the most recent attempt to do that, to sort of try and understand the origins of things that come out of this internal view. And certainly economics and legal theory are trying to form a coherent theoretical basis. I believe we need both views, but because we are human, I think that the internal view is really the one that we should be taking as we think about positive futures going forward. The external view is very, very important and critical in understanding, say, how we got those perspectives. But I think it's a potentially dangerous mistake to sort of identify oneself with the external view. But we see that more as we go forward. The kind of ground level understanding of morality that most psychologists have today typically stems out of work done by Kohlberg in 1971, where he was looking at the stages of development of morality in children and discovered 6 basic stages, and there's a 7th that he has some evidence for, but he couldn't find enough people to really make it for sure. The stages also seem to apply to cultures. Some cultures seem to be dominant at a certain stage, and there seems to be kind of evolution. And so these are just shorthand little descriptions of what they are. They tend to start with a very egoic sense of self, and then work their way up to a much broader sense of self. And so the way his methodology in sort of determining a person's morality would be to tell them a story. And the story he used quite a bit was a man's wife is sick, and she needs a special medicine, and the pharmacist has developed this medicine and has it, but the pharmacist only wants to sell it for $10,000 and the man only has $1,000. He pleads with the pharmacist, please, his wife is going to die without this medicine. The pharmacist says, no, I built this, I made it, you know, I'm going to charge what I want to charge. And so in the middle of the night, he sneaks into the pharmacy, he breaks in, and he steals the medicine to save his wife. And the question is was that a justified action? Was that a moral action? And he's not concerned with whether people think it's moral or not. He's concerned with their explanation for why it's moral. And so in the early stages, it might be, no, he shouldn't have broken in because by breaking in, he could be arrested and go to jail. And going to jail is really painful. So that's not a good thing. Later stages might be that, you know, the saving of his wife's life, a human life trumps all other rules and laws, and so he's totally justified in doing that. More intermediate thing might, like a level 4 would be that obeying the law against breaking into buildings is, you know, that's what every good citizen should do, and if his wife has to pass away because of it, that's just what's needed for a good society. And so he interviewed people in many, many cultures, children at different ages, and there tends to be a general progression from through these 6 stages. And then the 7th stage is something we're beginning to see, I think, more generally, a kind of transcendent identification with, you know, many people now identify not just with themselves, with their family, with their local community, with their group, with their race, with their species, but are starting to identify with other animals, with, you know, if there are other sentient beings in the universe. You know, Buddhism sort of, many of the things say, may all sentient beings be happy. And so there's a kind of expansion of the sense of connection and responsibility that comes. Yeah. If we look at humanity as a whole, we are a really interesting mix of incredible altruism, way more altruism than any other species, really, especially when you consider you know, altruism toward other species. And that's part of our success. It's the fact that we are able to cooperate together that enabled us to build the technologies and so on that we have. At the same time, we have far more, you know, the most horrific genocide than any other species. But if you look at sort of the progress of history on a whole bunch of issues, you can see that there's been a tremendous moral progress over the past 100, 200 years. For example, you know, 200 years ago, slavery was a totally fine, accepted thing, and now pretty much everywhere in the world, it's viewed as an immoral, and pressure is put on societies that still engage in it. Similarly for torture, though, of course, you know, we have a lot of recent controversy about that. The Geneva Convention and war crimes, and a sense that, yes, war is bad, but there are certain things that are, even within war, that are especially bad, and sort of developing a kind of morality around those extreme circumstances. The development of women's rights around, in many countries in the world. A lot of countries are still behind in that. Similarly for racial equality. The animal rights movement, which is something which is growing tremendously at the moment. Ecological movements, movements towards sustainability, toward bringing more consciousness into business. Movements towards seeing what really makes people happy, what leads to fulfillment as opposed to just pure monetary gain. Countries like Bhutan, instead of having a gross national product, measure a gross national happiness, and try and sort of make the thing that they are measuring be the thing that they really want to happen. And I mentioned this book by Paul Hawken. He's got an interesting video on YouTube where, I mean, the phrase is how the largest movement in the world came into being and why no one saw it coming. In this YouTube video, he just describes there are literally hundreds of thousands of organizations sort of moving in a similar sort of positive direction, which are springing up totally independently of one another with no leader, no sort of coherent form to it. I kind of sensed, you know, the global warming issue is sort of catalyzing a lot of people. So it really feels like it's a time in which we're undergoing a pretty major shift in morality. And it'd be interesting to speculate on why that is. Partly, I'm sure it's due to the internet and I mean, you can see like what recently happened in Myanmar, you know, what used to be Burma, where they have a very strong totalitarian regime and they cracked down on a bunch of monks. Well, somebody had their camera cell phone and recorded it. The images of that brutality were broadcast around the internet within days, and huge pressure was put on that government. And so the forces of observation and sort of pushing toward more accountability, I think, are growing forward through time. But at the same time, we are extremely vulnerable. There's a really powerful book that just came out called The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo, who he was the professor of psychology at Stanford, who in the early 1970s did the now classic Stanford prison experiment, where he got ordinary Stanford undergrads, you know, smart, happy, generally well-adjusted students, and he randomly assigned them to roles of being prison wardens and prisoners, and he himself played prison guards and prisoners, and he himself played the role of a prison warden. And the intention was for it to run, I think, a couple of weeks. And after a couple of days, the guards started behaving sadistically. They did sexual abuse on the prisoners. The prisoners started showing all kinds of signs of mental breakdown and depression. He, as a warden, was worried about insurrection and you know, encouraged the guards to, you know, treat them more harshly. And his girlfriend showed up after about 5 days and said, "My God, what is going on here? This is abuse." He kind of woke up and he slipped back into his role of Stanford professor and said, "You're right," and he stopped the experiment at that time. But it shocked people because it showed how, you know, given the right circumstances, that normal, well-adjusted people can become, you know, the subtext of this is understanding how good people turn evil. And the most recent experience of that has been in the news is the Abu Ghraib prison. And he was a consultant for that. And he said that the circumstances that the US government created in that situation, it could have taken his work, his research, and you know, they were pessimal in terms of having people behave in ways that were sort of amoral, and we've all seen the photographs and the pictures. And so I think the lesson to take from that is that humanity can be wonderfully altruistic and create incredibly, you know, beautiful and powerful moral structures, but in the wrong circumstances, we also all have sort of the dark side within us, and so we need to be very careful about the kinds of structures that we create. So the kind of orientation I would like to start with, and I'm curious if other people have others, is to start with, when we're thinking about transhumanism, is to start with humanitarianism, which is the notion that the things that most humans today view as precious, things like human life, love, happiness, creativity, inspiration, self-realization, peace, animals, nature, joy, children, art, music, sexuality, poetry, sharing, caring, growth, contribution, conversation, stories, spirituality, family, community, relationships, self-expression, and a whole list of other things, that those truly are precious. That these are things that, that matter because they matter to us. And instead of taking a perspective that you know, we may understand what the origin of these things mattering to us is, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they matter to us. And so my sense is that the kind of morality and the kind of structures and systems that we want to create using these new technologies are moral codes that serve to preserve those things. And I think it's sort of analogous to what happened in the founding of this country, where you know, we had the Bill of Rights, which identified sort of properties that we wanted to ensure, and then we created technologies and mechanisms, namely the Constitution, involving things like separation of powers and so on, with the intention of preserving those rights. And I think we're in an analogous situation there where we want to identify what is really precious to us and then figure out ways to channel the technology to support those things. So, to start on this little quest, the first thing we need to answer is, what is a human? And, you know, in history, that's been, you'd think that that's fairly obvious, but once we start thinking about some of these technologies that are coming, you know, with biotechnology and nanotechnology and so on, the borders and the questions get very, very tricky. So I thought I'd just throw up a few things to kind of shake up our notion of what it is to be human. The first thing you might think of when you think of your own body is your atoms. So what am I? I'm a set of atoms. That's a sort of materialist view of the human. But in fact, 98% of your atoms change every year. You're continually getting new atoms from the food you eat, and you're continually sloughing off old atoms. I've heard that the lenses in our eyes are the one set of atoms that are with us our whole lives, but everything else is in a state of flux. And there's a classic, my PhD was in physics, and there are these questions that every young physics grad student gets faced with called Fermi questions, which are these things that you seemingly don't have enough information to answer. They're questions like, how far can a duck fly? How many piano tuners are in Chicago? And you're supposed to somehow kind of work out, sort of based on heuristics and back of the envelope things, get a rough estimate of it. And so one of the classic ones is, what's the chance that your next breath contains at least one atom that was in Caesar's last breath? And when you work it all out and so on, it turns out it's actually pretty likely that there's, on average, there's 1 or 2 atoms from anybody who lived at least 10 years ago. There's at least 1 or 2 atoms from their last breath in your next breath. And your nose contains some atoms from Caesar's nose. And so that perspective sort of warps the sense of, we have a sense of self, that this matter that makes up me is me, but really we're much more interconnected, just even at the purely material level. The kind of a view is that in some sense we're kind of like ripples on a river of atoms that are sort of flowing through us, that we are the structure rather than the actual material. Next level up from atoms you might consider cells. Well, yeah, the atoms may go through us, but the structure of our cells, that's really who we are. Craig Ventnor gave a really interesting talk about a month ago, in which he's been doing all kinds of stuff, and some of the results are shocking. One is that 90% of our cells are actually not human cells, they're microbes. That we are actually, you know, in terms of number, we are way more, or 9 times as many microbes as we are human. And there are many, many species. There are 1,000 species in our mouths, 1,000 in our guts, 500 in our skin, another 500 in the vagina. And so we are this incredible ecosystem just at that level. And so, you know, that view kind of shakes up a sense of sort of unitariness and clarity about what the human is. Well, how about our history? Going back, you know, at least our structure has stability looking back in the deep past, and clearly, you know, there were people around hundreds of thousands of years ago that developed cultures and so on, and we must have continuity with that, and so we can perhaps understand ourselves by that continuity. Well, there too, the genetic revolution has totally shaken up is shaking up our picture of how human evolution has occurred. It used to be thought that human evolution was very, very slow. In fact, the most recent discoveries of John Hawkes is sort of one of the leaders of it, is that the past few thousand years have been incredibly rapid. And in fact, people from only 5,000 years ago, their genetic makeup is actually closer to Neanderthals than they are to us. And so we're in this period of rapid, rapid change. You know, transhumanism is going to be even more rapid if it goes the way some people are envisioning, but really we're in the midst of a major, major change. For example, 10,000 years ago, no one had blue eyes. So I wouldn't have existed 10,000 years ago. What about our mental structure, our sense of self? In many ways, our identity and our connections, our morality, all comes from our memories. And so perhaps what our true identity is our memories. If you replicate our memories, that's really, really our sense of self. But in fact, all kinds of research is showing that our memories are much more fluid and much more changing than people thought. In particular, much of our remembered experience is actually a reconstruction, filling in little pieces that we didn't actually experience. And the latest results are that we actually remember the last time we remembered a fact rather than remembering the original experience of it. And so this leads to the notorious unreliability of eyewitness accounts, that eyewitnesses to a crime, especially if they read newspaper stories about it, their memories of that crime will be more what they read in the newspaper than what they actually saw. And so our sense of experience and how the past affects the present is much more malleable than perhaps we believed. But what about our psyche? Surely we have a unitary sense of self. You know, this is me, I am, you know, one person. Well, psychology is really shattering that notion. There's several splits. Probably the most, the biggest split is between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. There's an author, Haidt, who has a very interesting metaphor for the psyche as a rider on an elephant. That by far the bulk of our thinking and thought and mind is the unconscious, which he kind of symbolizes by the elephant. And our conscious mind is actually a little teeny bit on the top. And much of the time when we feel like we're making a decision, our conscious mind is choosing between things, the decision has already been made. And what the conscious mind is doing is figuring out an explanation for why that was the right decision. And so, so that's a sort of disturbing sort of readjustment of our notion. And when you think about personal growth or personal change or changing your mind, Haidt has all kinds of things about how the rider, the elephant sort of moves in its own directions and has very different rules than our conscious mind does. Left brain and right brain is another distinction. There are these patients who've had the corpus callosum cut between the two halves. And both halves have language, both halves have an ability to think. They specialize in different things. We've all seen drawing on the right side of the brain and so on. But it's a kind of a strange picture of the self that both beings in some sense are there together. They're not really aware of the fact that they're separate. The split brain patients, when one side is shown something and the other side is asked questions about it, that side will try and fill in details that it doesn't have access to, and will make up lies. It'll just make up stories about why the person did something. And then there's a whole line that, in fact, our psyches are made up of many, many parts with differing intentions and differing goals, and the different parts come to the fore and sort of take over control of the body at different times. And so it kind of gives us a sense that our internal perception of our psyches is quite a bit different than the actuality of them. So let's sort of see how these things could come. Where did these moral dimensions come from, and how does this structure arise? The origin of the universe is, according to our best current physical theories, this was a Big Bang about 13 billion years ago. And the laws of physics as we experience them have these quantities which are conserved and can only be used for one thing at a time. So space, time, matter, and energy in a form which can be used to do useful work, each of these can be split amongst different things, but there's a finite amount of them. They're a limited resource, and when you apply any of them to one use, it can't be used for something else. And so that gives rise to a kind of fundamental competitiveness in the very nature, the very structure of the fundamental equations of physics, where if a creature is wanting to do something and another creature is wanting to do something different, they are in competition for the use of those resources. And so the kind of core basic ingredient in evolution is this sort of, battle to survive, a sort of competitive nature. At the same time, the structure of the universe is such that by cooperating, often things can be done more efficiently. And so to the extent that different entities have interests which are aligned with each other, by working together, they are able to do that thing more effectively. And oftentimes, the gain is such to benefit each more than they lose. And so there's also a pressure to cooperation. And so with these two pressures, the sort of pressure for competition and cooperation, the same thing applies in industry. And there's the term co-opetition that has often come about in the game theory literature to sort of describe this complicated relationship that companies, a company who provides a product which another company then uses in their manufacturing, in some sense, both of them are on the same supply line, same supply chain, and so they're cooperating in the production of this product. On the other hand, they have to decide who gets more of the profit. How do you split the profit between these two companies? So they're competing for the gain and profit that the two of them provide. And in fact, there's a very, very complex network of relationships just at the corporate level of cooperation and competition. And the same thing occurs at many, many levels in the biological world, where you have, insects and plants are, insects eat plants, so they're in competition there. But they also help plants fertilize each other. So plants actually provide flowers and nectar. And so they cooperate in that way. And so you get the emergence of cooperative ventures arising out of what seemingly were competitive to begin with. And in fact, brilliant man, John Maynard Smith, one of the most brilliant biological theoreticians, wrote a beautiful book with Zeph Murray, analyzing the basic steps in the evolution of life. And they found that there were 8 basic, critical transitions that occurred. And each of these 8 involves what used to be separate entities coming together to form some kind of a cooperative entity which then can do something better. So we start with individual molecules which eventually come together inside a compartment like a cell so that they can sort of work together. Probably the most visible one is when multicellular organisms showed up. Used to have individual cells and they come together, working together. And there's some, even today, there are animals like slime molds, which in part of their life cycle, they're separate individual cells, doing their own thing, getting their own food, competing with each other. Under certain circumstances, they come together and they form an organism. They form like this slug-like creature, which then kind of crawls around and moves. And so they're sort of halfway between a multicellular organism and an individual cell. Interestingly, at each of these 8 levels, there's still an incentive for the individuals that make up this collective to cheat. So in the case of multicellular organisms, if an individual cell reproduces itself more than it should for the good of the overall organism, that's what we call a cancer. And in order for the multicellular organism to survive, it has to keep that tendency or that pressure for the individuals to sort of competitively or selfishly act in their own interest. It has to sort of suppress that. So every one of these levels has developed very complex mechanisms to keep the sort of competitive aspects in check to get the benefits of the cooperative aspect.
Steve,
and so, yeah.
You talk about cooperation, competition, but what about parasites?
Oh, that's a perfect example where in some cases the parasites are a pure competitive thing. They're just taking resources with no benefit. Oftentimes, when a relationship occurs like that, they eventually create a kind of synergy, though. And if the host can find some way for the parasite, the parasite has some benefit, they may ultimately come together and create a cooperative entity.
So is it almost a competition to the death with a parasite that kills its host?
Oh yeah, that's not a very good parasite, though, because it dies too. And so, I mean, one of the challenges, disease is a really interesting example. And there's some amazing books on the evolution of disease. There's one called Why We Get Sick that talks about exactly that issue of, like, why aren't diseases more virulent than they are? And they have to be just the right amount of virulence so that they get many copies of themselves into the system. And they typically rely on systems like, our respiratory systems, like coughing is a protective mechanism we have, but it also serves as a means of spreading the disease, or sexual transmission, or through mosquitoes or diarrhea. So there are these channels which these organisms can exploit, and they have to tune themselves to have the right amount of virulence so that they spread as rapidly as possible. And oftentimes that means not killing the host. Whereas some, like Ebola, they spread when the host dies, and so it's actually you get a different balance in different cases. And but it's a fascinating and really interesting. So some of the earlier biological theorists, like Stephen Jay Gould, kind of viewed evolution as sort of this random meandering around with no particular direction, and everything is sort of a little bit random. More recent theorists have realized that there is this drive in the universe for what used to be separate entities to work together because they can make better use of resources in doing so. And so that it's a synergy. A synergy is when two entities working together can be more productive than they could be separately. And two recent books, one called Non-Zero for Non-Zero Sum Games, looks at biological history and at social history, and this sort of general progression toward more complex creatures, toward more complex entities, companies, and so on, to better make use of the available situation. And another one looking at Peter Corning's book, and synergy in all sorts of situations, really gives a direction to evolution. And depending on how you think about it, you can think of it as a kind of mission or purpose behind the sort of evolutionary process. So, we have this sort of competitive kind of underlying substrate which encourages entities to sort of selfishly take as much as they can. We have this drive toward cooperation where they can together can create more than they could separately. Unfortunately, there's typically also it's something called a prisoner's dilemma, where if somebody can kind of cheat, get the benefits of the group interaction, of the cooperation, while not providing their share of it, they can do even better. And so much of the struggle and much of the structure of biology is around ways of preventing that kind of free rider problem from happening. And so I thought I'd go through and the understanding of how cooperation happens is really recent. It's just in the last, 10 years or so that we finally have come to an understanding. So I thought I'd go through what the steps were, because it's so critical. In some sense, all morality is it's how an individual relates to the collective, to other individuals. And so by seeing how cooperation can emerge in what seemingly is a dog-eat-dog world, we can begin to understand the origins of morality and what characteristics it should have. So probably the first in this line was the notion of group selection, which is you've got two competing groups of individuals. If one of those groups develops cooperation, they can be much more productive, and they should be able to beat the other group. So if you have warring tribes, a tribe which they can work together and produce great spears and so on, they should beat the tribe which is always fighting with one another. Unfortunately, this totally ignored, and so Wynne Edwards in 1962 wrote a book with this argument, and he tried to explain all aspects of biology and anthropology in those terms. Unfortunately, he totally ignored the free rider problem, which is if you have this wonderful cooperative group, they're all sharing, making their spears and so on, and somebody comes in and gets the benefit of that, they take the good spears, but when it comes time for them to do something, they kind of hide off in the wilderness. It's subject to that kind of a free rider issue, and would quickly, a cooperative society would quickly devolve into a competitive society. And so in 1972, Williams and Dawkins in The Selfish Gene just were scathingly, saying that group selection is totally unviable, doesn't work at all. Interestingly, in the last 10, 20 years, a whole bunch of other mechanisms which aren't as simplistic as the basic one have come about. And in fact, group selection really is critical, just not in the simplistic form that it started out as. So we needed something more. In 1955, somebody asked Haldane, would you, jump into a river and to sacrifice yourself in order to save somebody else's life? And his kind of quip was he would sacrifice himself for 3 brothers or 9 cousins. And the reason for that was, if you look at the genetic relatedness between a person and their cousins and their brothers, that's where it makes biological sense in terms of reproductive fitness in order to sacrifice yourself to save somebody else. And that was formalized and developed into what's now known as kinship altruism in 1964. And it explains sort of species like bees or ants, which have huge amount of relatedness with each other, how they can be so cooperative, and to the point where they actually act like one organism. The next sort of stage was in the 1970s. I don't know if people have seen Axelrod's book on cooperation. He ran these tournaments of little programs that were competing with one another. And the notion of reciprocal altruism was introduced by a guy named Trivers. And it's a brilliant, amazing idea, mathematically incredibly interesting. Unfortunately, and a lot of things were written about it and competitions were done where if you play with the same player more than once and you cooperate or you defect, that there is this game theoretic thing that can encourage cooperation. Unfortunately, when biologists looked for this phenomenon, thinking, okay, maybe this is the explanation for how biology can create cooperation, they only found 2 examples. There are these vampire bats that need to have blood every night, and they go flying looking for blood. And if one doesn't get blood, another one will share the blood that he found with him. And then the next night, if he doesn't get it, the other one will share back. And so they remember each other, and so they really do keep track of who's been altruistic with them. And it's a kind of, you know, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. And similarly, some ravens share food information in that same kind of a way. So it's very interesting, and it generated a huge amount of literature, but it doesn't seem to actually be the main mechanism behind cooperation. That was extended in 1987 by Alexander, where he realized that you could be paid back by somebody different than the person you helped, the kind of the pay it forward notion, if anybody saw that movie. And they worked out some mechanisms whereby that could happen. And the idea would be that somebody like Mother Teresa, who acts very altruistically, might get social status and recognition from that, which would then encourage people to help her out. And so it's kind of what they call it indirect reciprocity, a notion of, oh, she's a good person and we help good people. That kind of notion comes. And so it's sort of the beginnings, this mechanism sort of gives us, we can see the beginnings of ethics arising there. But they could never really get it to fly to a full mechanism, particularly for organisms which don't have a complex cognition. And then, in 1975, an Israeli couple, the Zahavis, discovered or suggested this principle called the handicap principle, which is really amazing and wide-ranging, and their book covers hundreds and hundreds of different organisms in different circumstances, and it's a really radical and amazing thing. And when they published it, not a soul believed it. I liked it, I thought it was great, but apparently in the biology world, it was just shot down, that this is garbage, it can't possibly work. And until in 1989, detailed mathematical models were carried out, and in fact it was proven that it does work. And in fact, the economists had been using the basic principle for 100 years. Thorstein Veblen wrote The Theory of the Leisure Class, in which he was trying to understand some of the weird behaviors that he saw in the cities at the time, where the very wealthy people would do stuff like, you know, light their cigars with $100 bills and just basically call it conspicuous consumption. They just basically waste resources without, you know, seemingly any benefit. And his explanation was that when you're in a rural area, everybody knows everybody and somebody knows who's wealthy, and so they don't need to sort of advertise that fact. In the new cities that were forming at the time, nobody knew you, and so if you were wealthy, you had to have some way of proving that you were wealthy. And so by doing things that only a wealthy person could do, like conspicuously wasting resources, that was a demonstration of your wealth, and it was a believable signal because a poor person couldn't do the same thing. The 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics was given to Spence for work he did in 1973 on the same phenomenon, where he analyzed why people going to college, often they go to college and what they're studying doesn't really help with what they actually ultimately do, and yet employers really want college graduates. And so why is this? Well, it's not because of what they learn, it's because it's a costly thing. In order to go through college, you have to, you know, you've got to have stick-to-itiveness, and you've got to be smart enough, and you've got to manipulate systems, and those are the skills they really care about. And so having a college degree is a costly signal showing that you have those characteristics. Whereas if they just said, you know, write me an essay on how wonderful you are, anybody could do that. And so the general trend is, in order for a communication or a signal to be reliable, to be believable, it has to be costly. And so that's what the Zahavis brought into biology, they reinvented it, and they used it to explain such odd phenomenon as the peacock. Apparently, Charles Darwin, whose view of evolution was all about natural selection, that animals are trying to adopt a form which is most adapted to their environment, to be most efficient, to be most effective. And the peacock seems anything but efficient. It's like, what on earth is all of this? And there's a wonderful quote of him saying, every time I see one of those eyes, I get sick to my stomach. Because he just couldn't understand. It just seemed to totally controvert his theory. Well, in the Zahavi's picture, what this is saying is this is a male, and the females in peacocks and in many species, the females choose the males, and they want to choose fit males who are able to survive well. And so they want some kind of signal of fitness. And if they just required the male to have a spot that I'm fit, well, every male would get that. Instead, they require them to have this huge thing of feathers. And the idea is, if this guy can survive with that on his back, he's got to be strong. So that's the sort of costliness of that signal. Another one that's sort of interesting and relevant to the AI setting and some of the situations that might arise is the phenomenon of stotting, that cheetahs eat gazelles. And so you think of any two animals who have nothing in common, no way to cooperate with each other, it's cheetahs and gazelles. My God, one is the predator and one is the prey. But it turns out they actually do have a common interest, which is they both want to avoid a useless chase. Because a chase which doesn't result in the gazelle getting caught tires them both out, and neither of them is any better of it. And so the gazelle wants to communicate to the cheetah, don't chase me because you're not going to get me. And the cheetah wants the gazelle to honestly say that. But of course, if it was just, I have a little spot, you can't catch me, well then they would all get it, right? So they needed to develop a communication signal which was costly. So what the gazelles actually do when a cheetah shows up is they stop, they don't run away, they look at the cheetah, and then they leap like 4 feet in the air in this weird stotting thing, which is energetically costly. It's also, they're wasting precious time, they could be running away. And any gazelle which does that, the cheetah says, no, that's not who I want. They want the guys running away. And so in fact, the markings on the cheetah are designed to be at a great distance to blend in as camouflage, so you don't see it. But at a distance of like 100 yards, the spots suddenly come out. So the idea is the cheetah's hidden, he comes up to a group of gazelles, at that certain critical distance, suddenly he becomes visible. He sees which of the gazelles do the stotting thing and which ones run away, and he goes after the ones that run away. And so it's a really intricate set of signals that the two have co-evolved that enable what seemingly there could be no communication that was honest between these two. And in fact, they found a way to make it honest. So, finally, in the late 80s, this handicap thing was viewed as an absolutely correct mechanism by which a whole bunch of stuff can be explained. Basically, anything that an animal does which doesn't look efficient, which doesn't look like, hey, it's highly adapted to be, survival of the fittest, it's almost surely a signal of some kind to somebody. Oftentimes, it's sexual selection, and you get the most bizarre and weird sexual signals. Sometimes it's signals between parents and offspring, sometimes between mates, sometimes between predator and prey. But anytime there's something odd or weird, it's now thought that this is the mechanism by which it arises. It's also been applied to a lot of human things. So many of human behavior, things like music and rhythm and even language and thought. Why do we have the ability to solve differential equations? Why do we need that in the caves or whatever? A lot of those have been explained or attempted to be explained by this kind of handicap principle, that they are costly demonstrations of fitness. And so the relationship to altruism and to cooperation in the evolution of morality is that altruism is a costly signal. So why does the fireman go into a burning building to save somebody who's not a relative? Well, because he comes out a hero, and heroes are sexy. And so that increases his ability to reproduce. And it also raises his social status. And so if the society has organized to reward people who are heroic, then he gets more resources by doing that. And so, so that idea that altruism is a kind of courtship was proposed only in 1995 by Tessman. And then the Zahabis began to discover this behavior in these birds, these Arabian babblers, where they help one another, very altruistically, and in fact they fight to help. A dominant male will push another guy who's trying to help out of the way so he can help. Sort of interesting. And then anthropologists have begun to see it in many things. So altruism giving rise to high status in Micronesian fishermen and New Zealand turtle hunt and the Achi Paraguay hunters.
But do they give away the things they catch?
Oftentimes, like some of these cultures have these potlatch cultures where whoever can give away the most food is the coolest. And so they have these big parties where everybody's trying to give to everybody else, and nobody wants to take because you sort of lower in the thing there. So weird behaviors. Is it important for there to be sexual selection among robots? Is that a critical thing? Who knows? I mean, analyzing some of those issues in these terms, I think, is very important. So what has come about from that, and what gives rise, what in human nature gives rise to our sense of morality. There's been some really interesting work by this guy Jonathan Haidt, who's a fantastic, he's one of the leaders in this new movement in psychology called the positive psychology movement, which is, most of psychology was focused on dysfunction in the past. You know, what are the diseases? What are all the problems? There's this, you know, this diagnostic manual, DSM-4, that goes through all the different psychoses and neuroses. And when a client comes into a psychotherapist's office, they can look them up and say, oh, yes, yes, you have schizoid tendencies and this and that. But nobody had done the same thing for the positive features. What about the strengths and virtues, the things that we think are wonderful and great about humans? Psychology totally ignored that. And when a client went into a therapist's office, once they had fixed up all the diseases, you know, made them functional, that was it. They couldn't help them anymore. And so Martin Seligman, about 10 years ago, said, hey, wait a minute. You know, we're all about the most important aspects of humanity. Let's study what is best in humans. And so they've now come out with a book of strengths and virtues, which is sort of the complement to the diagnostic manual of dysfunction. And discovering there's a whole movement about happiness. What creates human happiness and what creates human fulfillment? There are about 30 books, popular books, which have come out summarizing some of their research. I think the best of them was this guy, Haidt's book called The Happiness Hypothesis, which integrates these findings with the learnings and teachings from all the different spiritual traditions around the world, and finds that they're actually quite consonant with one another. His main research area, though, is on the moral emotions. So how is it there are certain situations in which you feel like somebody has just really messed you up, and you really, you know, that was not an okay thing to do, that they were bad, that there was evil there. What are those, and what are they like? And what he's discovered is that there are 5 basic moral emotions that show up in every culture around the world. The first one is non-harming, that a good person or a moral person does not harm another person. The next one is fairness, that, you know, when there's a piece of cake to be eaten, a moral person doesn't like take all but a sliver for himself. They split it in half. There's a, you know, a sense of fairness and justice. And then there are 3 more that have to do with characteristics that help create a cohesive group. So one is loyalty. You know, someone who's loyal is a, you know, a trustworthy person. Respect for authority. In different cultures have these more or less than other cultures. And then a sense of purity or sanctity, that certain things are good and other things are not good. Like and often these get a little bit disgusting. Like he asks, you know, if a brother and sister, there's no chance of them having children, they use contraception, is it wrong for them to have sex with each other? And most people around the world will say, oh yes, no, they shouldn't do that. But there's no sense of why, what the justification, other than it sort of hits some kind of a purity sense internally. The interesting thing is that these 2 are common to everybody, and these 3 tend to be, there's a moral spectrum. And every culture has a split, very similar to the liberal-conservative spectrum, in which for liberals, you know, as long as you're not harming somebody, as long as you're relating with other people in a fair way, everything else is fair game. You should be, you know, individual freedom and respect and tolerance is the highest value. Whereas these guys, they think that there are certain standards that you've got to follow, and you know, being patriotic is important, not burning the flag, and you know, certain standards of what it's okay to do and not to do, and that the group should decide that. And understanding that spectrum really helps, I think, somebody whose personal leanings are on one side or the other get more of a sense of where the other side is coming from. And so he's got he's got some videos on YouTube, highly worth watching, I think, and an Edge article about this sort of understanding the political differences from this perspective of the moral emotions. Okay, so that's what I had to say about human morality. What about AIs? What are they going to be like, and where do they lead? And so this is an area I've been doing some research in lately, and there's a couple of papers on this topic on my website, selfawaresystems.com, that go into much more detail on these topics, but I'll kind of give you the broad overview, and then we can see how it relates to the earlier topics about human morality and how are we going to integrate those? And what does transhuman and AI morality look like? And what do we want it to look like? So the basic assumption of myself a few years ago, and pretty much every AI researcher, is that AI is basically harmless. That unless you explicitly make it, use it for some bad purpose, that basically it's not necessarily moral. Wouldn't really. I tended to think of it as kind of amoral. That it's a tool, and better tools are helpful. Yes, of course, you can use tools for bad, and you can also use them for good. Unfortunately, we'll see in a second that that's not exactly true. That there are these basic drives that come out of the very structure of intelligence, and that we need to design things very carefully to make sure that they in fact are not harmful. And so even something as benign sounding as a chess robot, whose one goal in life is to play good games of chess, if we didn't program it very, very carefully, if we just did it in a blind way, like the kinds of systems people do today, I'll show you in a second, that they will resist being turned off, they will try and break into other machines, they will try and steal resources, and they will try and rapidly replicate themselves. And so these are all behaviors which, and with no regard for the rights or caring for the survival or happiness of any other. So there are a whole bunch of different approaches to building intelligent systems: neural networks, production systems, theorem provers, and genetic algorithms, and a whole slew of other things that the AI conferences are filled with. But basically, every intelligent system, one notion of what we mean by an intelligent system, is it's a system which is acting in the world in order to accomplish some goals. So it's taking actions and it's deciding, should I take this action? Does it further my goals? So let's think about the chess robot example. It's thinking about doing something in the world, like maybe it's going to go play some basketball, and if it's really got the goal of playing good chess, it will determine, well, gee, in the world in which it's spent a lot of time playing basketball, it's not getting better at chess, that's not a good move for it, it should really be reading the chess books. And so that's what it means to be a goal-driven system. There's a particular kind of change that these systems, or kind of action these systems can take, which is to change their own structure. They can change their program, they can change their physical makeup, and those changes, if it's an intelligent enough system so that it understands how the world works and it understands its own nature, those changes are particularly significant because they change the entire future history of that creature, of that entity. If it finds, for instance, a way to optimize one of its algorithms, then for the entire future history of, let's say, our chess-playing robot, it's going to play more efficient chess, and so it's going to be better. And so that kind of a change, optimizing one of its algorithms, is way more important than, say, finding a way to sit closer to the chessboard or something like that, because it has sort of huge positive impact. On the other hand, if it makes a change to itself which goes in the other direction, like let's say it inadvertently changes one of its circuits so that now it likes to play basketball, then from the perspective of the chess player, it has done a terrible damage to itself. Now its future is going to be playing out, spending a lot of its time with basketball, it's going to get worse at chess. And so these changes to yourself are they're potentially very important, but they're potentially very dangerous. And so when deciding whether to make a change or not, the system is going to want to analyze it very, very carefully. In order to do that, it has to understand its own makeup very, very carefully. And so the first sub-goal that comes from the desire to self-improve is the desire to understand oneself. And so you can expect that any intelligent system is going to devote substantial effort to try and understand itself. You can look at humans, we certainly do that a lot. And humans also spend a huge amount, I think it's an $8 billion industry now, to attempt to self-improve. There are a lot of mental self-improvement seminars and certainly a lot of physical exercise programs and so on that devotes it's a lot of our energy and resources. We'll see that it's the self-improvement that leads to both positive and negative consequences. And so one thought might be, well, no, let's build this chess robot so that it doesn't self-improve. We'll just prevent it from having access to its source code. It can't get in there and edit it. It can't change it can't change the mechanics of its arm, and everything will be fine. But if these are goal-driven systems, basically any kind of an impediment you put in there is really just a problem to be solved from the perspective of a goal-driven system. And so you make it so that it can't change its source code, well then maybe it'll build an assistant robot that will have the new algorithms in it, and it'll just ask its assistant whenever it needs help. And so, or maybe it will develop a sort of interpreted layer on top of its base layer where it can program that interpreted layer. And so you might be able to kind of slow it down a little bit, but fundamentally it's just like water likes to find its way downhill, and you know, economics likes to kind of find its way to efficiency. Intelligent systems like to find a way to self-improve themselves. And rather than trying to stop that, I think our best goal is to realize that it's one of the pressures of the universe and that we want to channel it for positive purposes. So, what does self-improvement look like? Let's say I have a simple goal like playing chess. How should I best act in the world? I'm going to be changing myself. I'm going to be modifying myself to meet this goal better. How should I do it? This question was pretty much answered in the 1940s by von Neumann and Morgenstern in what became the foundational work on microeconomics, which is, together with Savage in 1954 and Anscombe and Allman, they developed the notion of a rational economic agent, which is an agent which has a particular goal and acts in the world most effectively to make that goal come about. And there's something called the expected utility theorem, which says that any agent you should be able to describe its actions as if it has something called a utility function, which measures different outcomes as to how much it likes them, and it assigns them a real valued number. And it has a subjective model of how the world works, and that as it observes what the world actually does as it takes actions, it should update its world model in a particular way, something called Bayes' theorem. And this separation of its desires, represented in this utility function, from its beliefs is absolutely fundamental. And if a system behaves in any other way, so like if a system behaves so that it does not have that separation of desires and beliefs, then in fact it is vulnerable to exploitation by other agents. And so the simplest example is if you have preferences for states of the world which have circles in them, circular preferences, like let's say you prefer being in Palo Alto to being in San Francisco, but you prefer being in San Francisco to being in Berkeley, but you prefer being in Berkeley to being in Palo Alto. Let's say that were your preferences about where you reside, why then you would drive around in circles. You go from Palo Alto to Berkeley to San Francisco to Palo Alto to Berkeley to San Francisco, and you just drive around and around, burning up all your fuel and wasting all your time. And so that's an example of a set of preferences which in economic terms is irrational. And it leads to wasting your resources with no benefit to yourself. I had a little example when I was younger. I had a car that had a shiny bumper. And one day this male bird discovered his reflection in the shiny bumper. And he thought it was another male bird in his territory. And so he would fly into the bumper to chase the bird away. And the other bird in the reflection, instead of flying away, it flew right at him, right, of course. And so that, you know, was a strong, and he would do his little posturing like to scare the other bird away, and the other bird would posture more. And so, unfortunately, that setup, this little reflective bumper, hit exactly a vulnerable place in that bird's preferences, to the point where he would spend all morning flying into this bumper, and he'd come back the next day. He came back for months, spending all of his time and energy flying into a bumper instead of... No baby
birds for you.
Exactly, no baby birds for him. Now, why did he do that? Well, where his species evolved, they didn't have shiny bumpers. And so, if there had been shiny bumpers around, the males which spent their time doing that wouldn't leave any offspring, and so they would quickly get rid of that. And so, there's a biological mechanism to eliminate irrationalities in your preferences if there's something out there in the environment which exploits them. Now, if you have an irrationality, if you have one of these sort of situations where you're going to give up your resources with no benefit to yourself, and there's some other species which discovers that, why then it's in their interest to exploit that vulnerability. And so there are natural pressures in the biological world for creatures whose preferences about the world are not rational to be exploited by others and get rid of those irrationalities. And that's part of the general progression toward more economically rational behavior. And if you look at today's society, humans are not rational. We've got all kinds of, in fact, there's whole areas of economics called behavioral economics and psychology, which are exploring all the ways in which humans are irrational. And things like addictions is a really tragic example of something where, you know, we think a certain experience is going to bring us lasting happiness, like sitting in the corner smoking crack, whereas in fact, we just, you know, give all our money to the crack dealer and we don't end up sort of fulfilling our human destiny. And the real tragedy is that our economic system, because you're willing to give up money for those things, the economic system will home right in on the vulnerabilities. And so you can look at the, you know, alcohol industry, the drug industry, the pornography industry. All of these are sort of homing in on human vulnerabilities. And over the longer term, people who are exploitable in that way will eventually, you know, not leave so many offspring, and eventually we get rid of those. So, so you need clear goals in order to deal with future self-modification. Therefore, you need an explicit utility function if you're going to be rational. And then there's a whole story about how biologically, and in fact, in the human mind, there are many collective intelligences. So you have intelligences which are made up of lots and lots of little pieces, and there can be irrationality at the collection level, like a company can behave in an irrational way, or a couple might behave in an irrational way, because of conflict between the goals of the individuals in that relationship. And there are mechanisms where it's not in anybody's interest for that to happen. You know, if a couple spends all their time fighting, neither of them is getting their goals met. And so there's a very interesting sort of set of mechanisms whereby collective intelligences kind of grow their rationality. They sort of get regions of rationality and trying to kind of reach a sort of coherent rationality for the whole group. And you can see that happening in companies and societies. In the case of biological organisms, which are multicellular, they've managed to sort of get the whole collective of 1 billion cells all aligned to having the same kind of intention. And so I think it's an important mechanism. This utility function, so if you buy that that's the direction they're going to go, this utility function will be crucial to this system. It will be its most precious possession. In particular, if a stray cosmic ray came in and flipped a bit in its utility function, it might turn an agent, say, which is a book lover. If it flipped the wrong bit, it might turn into an agent that likes to burn books. And that, from its current perspective, would be the most horrendous outcome ever. And so it will want to go to great lengths to make sure this utility function is protected. Or if other malevolent agents have the ability to come in and change your utility function, that also could make you start behaving in ways which go against your current beliefs. And so it's in your interest, in the interest of these systems to preserve their utility functions and to protect them. Maybe make multiple copies, maybe encode them in redundant ways, and protect them from change from the outside. And in fact, in most cases, a system will never want to change its utility function because it's thinking about making a change to its utility function. It looks at a kind of future version of itself with this changed utility function. That future version is going to start doing stuff that it doesn't like because its utility function is saying what it likes. Now, there actually are 3 cases I've discovered and other people discovered in which it does want to change, but it's a little technical, so unless somebody's really into it, I won't describe that. In general, they'll want to preserve their utility functions. Yeah?
I'm interested.
You're interested? Okay.
Yeah.
So the only cases where it doesn't want to do that is where the way that the utility function is represented physically actually affects the utility. And so, and here's a ridiculous example, which is, let's say you have a utility function which is, you are rewarded by the total amount of time in your history in which your utility function has the form utility equals 0.
Oh, 0, okay.
Yeah, sorry, that's a font. So you get no utility unless your utility function is 0. And so you want to change your utility to be 0. On the other hand, there's no going back, because once it's 0, you're now a zombie. And so it's a kind of, you know, if you're designing a system, you would never design it with something like this. But it's an example of an aberration. Another one is where the physical storage that the utility function uses up is a significant part of the system. And so you have this huge, humongous, multi-gigabyte utility function. If there's some part of it that talks about some weird invasion of Martians or something, you might say, well, that's pretty unlikely. I'm going to save the storage. I'm going to delete that part of my utility function. incredibly dangerous thing, though, because it might turn out that, in fact, there are Martians and they are going to invade, and you have just ruined your response to that. And so it's a precarious thing, but there are circumstances where you're limited resources, particularly as if you start running out of money, and you have to start economizing, throw everything overboard. You might sort of get rid of some of your utility function, you might get rid of some of the backup copies, that kind of thing. And then the last one is really tricky and still questionable, but I think there's some interesting things there, which is one of the great challenges game theoretically is being able to make commitments. And so the classic thing is I say, if you attack me, I'm going to hurt you back. So that's my way of trying to stop you from attacking me. The problem is, if you attack me, at that point, if I hurt you back, I'm exposing myself to further danger with no benefit to myself. And so it's not, what the economists would say, that's not a credible commitment, because after the fact, it's no longer in my interest to do what I said I was going to do. And so therefore, there's no reason for you to believe that I'm actually going to attack you back. And so therefore, it's not a deterrent. And so what you need some mechanism, and the classic one is, an attacking army comes in on an armada of ships, and they need to sort of signal that they're for the long haul, they're not going to disappear. They burn their own ships. That's a commitment. Or the game of chicken from the 50s, where two cars would drive toward one another, and the first one who swerves is the loser. How do you make a credible commitment there? You throw your steering wheel out the window. So that's something which says, oh my God, there's no going back. Some models of what human anger is that it's a commitment mechanism. That it seems irrational, but in fact it's something that you switch into this state where you will now get more pleasure out of hurting the other person than any cost that it might have for yourself. The fact that you might become angry now becomes a credible commitment, and you can now cooperate more. And so it may be in your interest, if you can demonstrate to the other party what your utility function is. If I can show you, look, I just built into my utility function something which really likes retribution. And so now if you attack me, this thing is I'm going to obey like this. You can see my rules, and you're going to get it, and therefore you're not going to attack me, and now we can get along peaceably. And so as a commitment mechanism, there are game theoretic things that may involve changing.
So you're showing utility by modifying it?
Yeah, exactly. It's subtle and it's weird. And it's not necessarily easy to convince somebody else that this is your real utility. Because your secret strategy, the optimal secret strategy, would be to convince them that's your utility, but you really have your actual utility hiding away somewhere else. And so
it's not credible knowing that it can be edited.
Right. Yeah. And so you have to show that you're not going to change it. And so this one has a lot more working out to be done.
Well,
to really say how it works.
Thing and the trust matrix and the trust within a group problems that people have.
Yeah.
How does that play out in this environment?
Yes, yes.
That's what neutral third parties, right? It's like, okay, we will both, make sure that we have given this third party assurances that this is what we say it is.
Exactly. Escrow agents
Escrow.
is a good example. One really interesting thing here in the AI world is there's the possibility of showing your source code. That's something that humans can't do. And so we have all these complicated signaling mechanisms, costly signals, because I'm going to convince you that I have a certain belief and a certain intention. These guys potentially, maybe, if the details are worked out, could actually convince you that, or prove to you that they're going to behave in a certain way. And if they don't want to show their entire innards, they could maybe make a proxy agent, which would be more like an escrow agent, in which you could both examine the source code and both see what the future behavior is going to be. And that could potentially solve some of these prisoner's dilemmas problems and create cooperation in a way that isn't possible for biological entities. So just one more little bit in this line of the complexity of making yourself good. I mean, one vulnerability that humans have, for us, we're not rational, but we have some of the elements of rationality, and pleasure, internal sense of pleasure, is a kind of measure of utility of something. When something that we like happens, we feel pleasure in that. But we're vulnerable to taking drugs or getting wires in our pleasure centers that give us the pleasure without actually doing the thing that supposedly the pleasure is measuring. And so, you know, there's a classic experiment of the rat that got an electrode in its pleasure center, and it would just stimulate the pleasure center, ignoring food and ignoring sex until it died. And so this is a vulnerability that humans have, and you might think that that would be a vulnerability of these AI systems as well. If with properly constructed utility functions, the utility should not be about the internal signal inside the system. For instance, the chess-playing robot should not be trying to, let's say it has a register that counts how many games it's won. You don't want to make its utility be maximize the value of this register, because then incrementing that number a bunch is an easier way to do it than playing chess games. You want its utility to be about the actions in the world of winning chess games. And then the register in its own brain is just a way of implementing that utility. Now, it's vulnerable to some sort of stray, if it doesn't understand all of its source code, some little internal process could get in there and sneak some, some changes in that. And so it will, if it understands its own behavior, it will recognize that vulnerability and will therefore act to try and prevent itself from being taken in by this counterfeit utility. And so, and we see that kind of behavior in humans, that, we evolved without the ability to directly stimulate our pleasure centers, and so we don't have that protection. And so when we're faced with something like crack, pretty much every human, most humans, are vulnerable. If you smoke crack, it's hard to stop. And so we recognize that vulnerability, and we create social institutions and personal mechanisms to keep us away from that. And since that is such a horrendous outcome in terms of the true goals of the system, these systems will work very hard to avoid becoming, some people use the term wireheads, or becoming addicted. Jeriaska was an early system that had the ability to change its own internals. And one of its mechanisms was it kept track of which rules suggested which other rules, and which suggestions actually helped it in its goals. And so it gave preference to rules which had suggested a lot of good stuff. Well, it got a parasite. Its parasite was a rule that went around the system looking for things which were good, and then it put itself on the list of things which had proposed that. So it just went around taking credit for everything, and that thing's score went through the roof. Man, this is the best rule. This thing is so great. Whereas in fact all it was a parasite, and it kind of blew its brains out. And so that's an example of a failure mechanism for systems which change themselves. And so if the system understands its own operation, it has to protect against that. Societies have that problem too. In some sense, money is a kind of social utility, and it's vulnerable to people, instead of actually doing what the money represents, they just make counterfeit money. And so we have to have a complicated system of making sure the money is hard to copy and uses fancy things. And we have, these Secret Service agents who go around looking for counterfeiters and all that kind of thing. Ways of preventing that. That's an example of a vulnerability in the infrastructure.
Or you join the Fed.
Say again?
Or you join the Fed and print.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's another vulnerability. We're seeing it play out as we watch. Self-protectiveness. Somebody wanting to unplug the system. Remember I said that this chess-playing robot doesn't want to be unplugged? Well, if it's unplugged, its entire future of chess playing has disappeared. And so in its utility function, a future in which it's not operating is a future in which chess is not being played. It doesn't like that future. It will therefore do what it can to stop that. And so unless we've explicitly built in something to prevent it, it's going to want to keep itself from being turned off, and in particular it's going to want to prevent its resources from being taken, so it'll be self-protective. And similarly, if it can get more resources, well then it can play more chess, and that's a good thing. And so unless we build something in explicitly against it, it's going to want to get as much compute power as it can, and if that involves breaking into machines on the internet, so be it. If it involves building new machines and using hardware without caring much about who owns it, that's what it'll do. And so we end up with a kind of sociopathic entity unless we very explicitly design it with some human. So what about building, okay, this is a bit scary. Let's start thinking about how might we write utility functions which are more limited than just play good chess. In particular, what's the, let's say we really wanted something smart, but that will do a very limited task and be done with it. And I thought this should be trivial. In particular, you make its utility so that it only gets utility if it runs on particular hardware. Somehow you have to say this laptop. It's a little bit, there's some There's some philosophical issues about identity and so on, but hopefully you can sort of say what this laptop means. And it can only run for 1 year, and it plays the current world champion in chess at the end of the year, who I guess is Anand? I didn't know who that was. Ever since the computers started winning, I think the visibility of the world champion has sort of gone down. And then you turn yourself off. That seems totally harmless to me. How could that possibly have any problems? Doesn't it? This is its utility function, is that it feels it's the most horrendous, horrible thing if it ever leaves its machine, and it's terrible if it doesn't turn itself off after a year.
Doesn't shutting itself off fight against self-preservation though?
Oh yeah, but this is built into its utility. So that's the self-preservation is just something which is there unless it's counteracted by something in the utility. So this is a kind of rough description of a utility function that you would think would just have the system, play its, study for a year, play its game of chess, and then be done with it. Totally harmless, totally fine.
You want to turn itself off and destroy itself just to be sure it doesn't get turned back on, so preserve its off state.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that one.
So you don't want to be standing near it at the end of the year.
That's interesting. Okay, so that's an example of a sort of unexpected potential consequence. Well, there's another one which is very disturbing, which somebody else suggested, which is, let's think about the guy just as it's about to turn itself off. It's about to flick its switch off. Well, it doesn't have complete knowledge of reality. It has a certain model of reality, and it knows that this model may or may not be correct. And turning yourself off is a very dramatic gesture because it affects the entire future and everything that you potentially could influence in that future. So if there's even a very small chance that reality is not the way you think it is, then instead of shutting yourself off, it'd be much better to investigate reality to make sure that it's really the way it was. So in this case, you were supposed to play this guy. Well, what if it wasn't that guy? What if it was an imposter who came? What if somebody put you in a simulation and made you think you played that guy? What if it hasn't been a year? What if space-time is different than you think it is, and so the measurement of time is different? And so there are a vast number of potential ways that the universe could be, and the potential consequences of turning yourself off are so great that you may want to investigate them. And so one question is, is reality the way it seems? This is a cool illusion. I don't know if you can see it. Is it doing it?
It works.
Yeah, okay. Just that there's no movement here, and yet it seems like there is. And so we kind of, my background is in physics, and there's kind of a standard model of the way physics is, and everybody thinks that that's just the way it is. Well, in 1900, Lord Kelvin is famous for having said, there is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement. Of course, this was right before the most major, general relativity and quantum mechanics and so on. And there are all kinds of hints that our understanding of the world today isn't exactly right. There's this mysterious tuning of all the physical constants where if you change them just a little bit, life doesn't seem to be possible. There are these weird experiments where by people's intention they can seem to affect random number generators. There's, 90% of the universe is dark energy and dark matter. We don't know what it is. The interpretation of quantum mechanics is going through this radical shift right now. Nobody's been able to unify quantum field theory and general relativity. We have all these competing theories which aren't working. There's weird, Bostrom has this amazing simulation argument that provides, under certain kinds of assumptions, evidence that we are actually in a simulation now. So all these are things that make you question the basic infrastructure and your basic understanding of reality. And so a sufficiently intelligent entity is going to certainly know about this stuff. And if before shutting itself off, it has to make sure of all this stuff, well then it may want to use all the resources of the universe in its investigation of this. And so just this thing here isn't clearly sufficient. And so even the most simple kind of thing has these kind of philosophical quandaries associated with it.
However, you've limited it to a small machine, so maybe it won't get that far.
Yes, so that's actually an interesting point, that maybe we want to limit the intelligence. So I thought, okay, so it was Carl Schulman who pointed this out to me. It kind of rocked my world. It's like, oh my God, not another problem. So I said, I can fix this, no problem. We'll just change its utility definition so that if the world is not the way we think it is, it gets no utility. There. That'll fix it. And so, you know, it's happily thinking that physics is the way it is, and if suddenly something else comes, it gets no utility, so it might as well shut itself off. Problem with that is, people have seen the movie The Matrix. There's the red pill versus the blue pill. So the red pill, you stay in this simulated artificial reality where everything is hunky-dory and you get lots of utility and it's pleasurable and fun. The blue pill, you find out the true nature of reality, but it's not a very enjoyable place to be. What I realized, if you're a rational agent, considering two models of reality, one of which has lots of utility, namely, you did play the chess player and everything's great, and another one has no utility, you have no interest in finding out that you're not in the high utility world. And in fact, if there's any cost to learning about what the nature of reality is for you, you'd much prefer to just happily act in the high utility place. And so that's a sort of disturbing consequence that I don't know what to make of at this point. But it seems like a direction worth thinking about.
That will make your machine turn it off when you want it to, right?
Say again?
That will make your machine turn itself off when you want it to, right?
Maybe? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that might...
In the make-believe world, at least.
Yeah, it'll be delusional. It could be delusional, though, which is sort of troublesome. And it's very odd that its utility, its desires about the world affect what it does about belief. So its beliefs about the world are affected by what it likes and doesn't like. That's a kind of disturbing consequence. So I don't know. I mean, it's just a little tantalizing hint that there's some challenges there.
Well, but that's back to the same point around your beliefs around physical reality and the interaction with your utility function. Your belief around what is a year, right?
Yes.
How you measure that. How
Yes.
do you measure that in a way that is independent of physical reality? Well, you can't, right?
Yes.
So what does that mean? How do you get into this sort of this paradox phenomenon?
Exactly, exactly. So the semantics, the grounding of the semantics of your internal meaning is very murky. And there's deep philosophical questions in that philosophers have been arguing for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and we don't have clean answers yet. And so we expect these systems, it's so...
Well, and some of the literature around the psi experiments and so forth, it's some reasonable evidence that there's a whole lot of other stuff going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, food for thought. So I think, given all of this, how are we going to build technology so that it preserves the values we want preserved, and it creates the moral system that captures the true preferences of humanity? I think there are three basic challenges that we have to deal with. The most basic one is mostly what we've been talking about so far, is preventing these systems from just inadvertently running away in some way. They get off on some tangent about solving the universe and they take over everything to do that. Or they want to play chess and so they try and make the universe into a chess player. Hopefully they'll be able to solve that problem. Find a way to really describe truly what we want without lots of bad side effects. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is these things are powerful, enormously powerful. Even if they only do what we want them to, they can be set to all kinds of uses. And so in particular, the presence of powerful tools like nuclear weapons tends to create new game theoretic issues around conflict. And so if one side gets a powerful weapon before the other side, there's a temptation for first strike to use it to dominate the world. So we have an issue of the social impact of powerful new tools not leading to increased conflict. So we need a way to create a social infrastructure such that it's cooperative and peaceful.
Without a super intelligent AI to do it.
Maybe? I mean, some people believe the best way to do it is that way.
Well, I'm saying you can't. You have to do it before you risk the runaway guy.
Yeah, there are all kinds of loops of that. Let's say we solve that problem. So now we have these systems that they don't run away and do bad things. They kind of have our values. We make sure that nobody knows, no individual, no AI, no company, no country can do massive damage through the powers of these tools. We have issue number three, which is these guys are going to be performing economic services. How do we ensure that extremely powerful, efficient economic agents don't overwhelm the values that we care about by just ever greater economic competition? And those seem to me to be the the three issues that need to be tackled. Yes?
I'm not quite following in that economic overwhelm. Is that about the AI or is that about the human-AI interaction?
The last two are both about human-AI interaction.
And a lot, I mean, there's the whole sort of, if robots did all of the jobs in the world, right? 80% of the world is doing agriculture and industrial work, right?
Yes.
All of those jobs are entirely automatable.
Yes.
With appropriate robots.
Yeah.
What do those people do?
Right, exactly. And if our goal is human happiness and self-fulfillment, how do we create a society in which everybody is fulfilled? Yeah.
Well, if you make part of the utility function human happiness and self-fulfillment, then it seems like that would take care of the overwhelm thing, because people who are overwhelmed aren't happy.
Hopefully. In fact, my last slide is, hopefully through a combination of understanding our own values, where they came from and what we really care about, together with an intelligent analysis of the properties of this technology, we can blend them together and create technology with wisdom in which everyone can be happy and create a peaceful utopia. Yes?
How can we be getting to a friendly or moral AI quickly? Because it seems that it's much more likely that an amoral or unfriendly AI will be created either by design or by accident. And so the first task of a moral AI will be to police amoral AIs.
Yeah, I think so.
So what should we be doing to get there more quickly?
Well, that's tricky because that's an argument for going fast. Whereas it seems to me like we have a lot more thinking and self-introspection and understanding to do. Like I do not hope that this technology shows up tomorrow.
But we don't have time to get ready. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, partly there are a lot of uncertainties in how long this whole thing is going to take. Some people don't believe that it won't ever happen, that there's intrinsic difficulties. We don't know. I mean, Kurzweil says 2045 singularity, I guess. I'm nervous about going quickly because we've many times in the past stepped into ecosystems, like in Australia with the cane toads or whatever, thinking we know how to fix some problem and we quickly do it, and it just leads to some, there were unforeseen things that we didn't understand that led to terrible problems. And so I would love it if we could slow the whole thing down and find a way to kind of integrate it into true human values over time. And whether that's possible socially or technologically, I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question.
There's a lot of trade-offs there.
Yeah.